Just a temp. That's what Dr. Mercer had called her during rounds, his voice carrying the kind of dismissal reserved for people who didn't belong. Rachel Torres had accepted the assignment at St. Michael's in Savannah without protest, the way she accepted every demeaning shift and every task he was willing to push toward someone with no permanent standing. Her cold stare was the only response she'd given him, the kind of flat, unreadable look that had learned to surface in rooms full of men who believed they were measuring her worth. They didn't know who she actually was. More importantly, they didn't know what her hands could do when a body was coming apart. The fluorescent lights of the ICU cast shadows that made everyone look like ghosts. Rachel moved through the ward at 3 in the morning, her scrubs still crisp despite the shift she'd worked since 5 that afternoon. The antiseptic smell hung in the air like a permanent resident, mixing with the distant mechanical rhythm of ventilators, a sound like metal lungs, steady and relentless. Her left hand bore scars that could have belonged to an industrial accident or a construction site, but they actually looked like shrapnel damage if someone knew what to look for. Nobody ever asked. That was the gift of being invisible. In her locker downstairs, folded with precise military quarters, sat an American flag. Not a large one. Not the kind that flew at ceremonies. This was a small flag, 13 inches by 20, the kind that draped a folded cloth that had belonged to someone else. She kept it under her street clothes, wrapped in a Ziploc bag. The only proof that Captain Rachel Torres had ever existed in the first place. The only evidence that 3 years ago, before the Pentagon erased her from every database and whispered classified explanations to people who didn't need to know, she had been someone's commanding officer. She had led men and women into places where the light didn't reach, where decisions took 2 seconds and consequences lasted forever. The Navy SEAL in Bed 7 had been transferred to St. Michael's 3 days ago, evacuated from Ramadi with catastrophic blast injuries that had left him suspended in the space between recovery and permanent damage. His left leg was gone below the knee. His right arm had been reconstructed with surgical wire and careful prayer. But he was breathing on his own now, which meant something. Most things in medicine meant something if you knew how to read the signs. Rachel adjusted his ventilator settings without looking at his face. She'd learned not to form attachments to patients who reminded her of her old team. This one was different though. This one had filled the role she'd occupied before the extraction gone wrong. This one was someone's medic, which meant he understood the way pain was data, the way blood loss was a clock, the way staying calm was the difference between someone walking out of a building or being carried out. She ran her finger down his chart, her movements economical and precise. The kind of efficiency that came from treating sucking chest wounds under enemy fire, from knowing that hesitation was sometimes the only difference between fixing a problem and letting it kill everyone. She didn't notice Dr. Mercer watching from the nurse's station until she felt the weight of his attention shift toward her like a searchlight. Richard Mercer had the kind of face that suggested old money and the particular arrogance that came with believing that credentials were the same as competence. He was tall enough to command a room just by standing, the type of physician who made rounds like territorial inspections, his white coat trailing behind him like a cape that nobody had actually given him permission to wear. He had been at St. Michael's for 7 years, long enough to know everyone, not long enough to have made a real difference to anyone. He swept past Rachel's station with his entourage, 2 residents and a medical student who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, and Rachel didn't so much as glance up from the chart in her hands. But Mercer's jaw had tightened. She'd seen it happen, that micro-expression that preceded most confrontations. He'd noticed something. The question was what? The next morning, the assignments board outside the break room had her name listed for a shift in the basement supply room starting at 6 in the evening. Not the ICU. Not trauma. The basement, where the temperature was wrong and the fluorescent lights buzzed like insects trapped in plastic, and the medical supply inventory sat in organized rows waiting for someone to count them. Rachel took the assignment without comment, the way she took everything, with the internal silence of someone who had learned that objections were weapons people used against you. What Mercer didn't see was the reason she'd been studying the trauma inventory logs during her charting at 3 in the morning. The equipment orders didn't match the patient treatments. There was a discrepancy in the angiocath needle counts, particularly the 14-gauge needles used for emergency decompression. The supply orders showed 480 units per month, but the actual usage logs tracked by the nurses showed maybe 120. That meant 360 units of expensive equipment were being ordered and either missing or diverted. The medication cabinet logs showed similar problems, succinylcholine doses being recorded as administered when certain patients were discharged without evidence of intubation, midazolam shipments that arrived but never appeared in the pharmacy inventory system. Rachel had the kind of eye that could spot patterns in chaos. It came from years of military training, from learning to notice when something didn't fit, when the numbers told a different story than the narrative. Pain was data. Blood loss was a clock. And a hospital supply chain was a story that could be read in spreadsheets if you knew what you were looking for. The basement assignment lasted 3 nights. Rachel counted bandages and for tubing and sterile gloves with the kind of methodical focus that made time move like sap through wood. But her eyes were working on a different problem. She pulled the trauma inventory logs from their plastic holders and photographed them with her phone, a cheap prepaid device that she'd bought for cash at a CVS and kept separate from everything else. Screenshots of order sheets. Documentation of doses. The evidence of a pattern that most people would have overlooked entirely, dismissed as clerical error or outdated record keeping. On the 4th evening, the assignment's board changed again. She was scheduled for the ICU but the graveyard shift, midnight to 8, which meant working under the supervision of a night shift charge nurse who was new and overwhelmed and unlikely to notice when Rachel moved between departments checking supply levels. Mercer would be in his office during those hours, if he came in at all. The night shift belonged to the nurses who knew how to move quietly through hospitals, who understood how to exist in the margins where nobody was really watching. The SEAL in bed 7 had developed a cough by her second night back in the ICU. Not a serious one, not yet, but the kind of cough that suggested his lungs were doing work, that his body was trying to wake up. His oxygen saturation was holding steady at 93% on minimal support. Rachel adjusted the ventilator settings with hands that moved like they were following a script written in muscle memory. She didn't speak to him. He didn't ask questions. But when she checked his catheter and adjusted his for line, she saw his eyes tracking her movement, recognition flickering in his pupils. She paused. Just for a second. Long enough to meet his gaze, long enough for something to pass between them that didn't require words. Recognition of what she was. Understanding that he knew. Then she moved on to the next patient, her face as blank as a wall. The problem with being invisible is that people start to believe you actually are. They stop seeing the competence in your hands, the precision in the way you work, the depth of knowledge that lives underneath the silence. Dr. Mercer started assigning her the undesirable shifts, the scut work that nobody wanted, the patients with behavioral problems or difficult families. He was testing her, Rachel understood. He was pushing to see where her compliance ended, how much she would accept before she pushed back. But what he didn't understand was that she'd spent 3 years already accepting everything. 3 years of being nobody. 3 years of learning that objection and argument were luxuries that people with hidden identities couldn't afford. She accepted every assignment without protest. Her cold stare was her only commentary on the work, her only response to his subtle dismissals. And all the while, her eyes were working on a different problem entirely, tracking discrepancies in supply orders and medication counts, building a picture of something that was rotten at the foundation of this hospital. The rain came that night, the kind of rain that hammered the parking lot like accusation. Rachel stood at her locker during a break, looking at the folded flag beneath her civilian clothes, and wondered if Mercer had any idea what he was playing with. Wondered if he understood that the person he was pushing around had already survived things that would have broken most people. That she was not actually compliant. She was just patient. And there was a world of difference between the two. The grand round spectacle began Thursday morning when Dr. Mercer positioned himself before 12 medical students and 4 attending physicians, holding up Rachel's charting on the SEAL patient like contaminated evidence. "This is what inadequate documentation looks like," he announced, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of a man who'd rehearsed this moment. "Our temp nurse here apparently believes trauma patients require less thorough charting than her previous experience at," he made a show of checking her file, "community health clinics in rural Georgia." Laughter rippled through the interns. The sound landed like small stones in still water. Rachel stood against the wall with her shoulders square, her cold stare fixed on a point 6 inches above Mercer's head. Her hands hung loose at her sides. Not trembling. Not burning red. Not retreating. Just watching. Waiting. The way you watch a predator that hasn't noticed you yet. Perhaps Miss Torres would like to explain to these future physicians why she's questioning medication dosages prescribed by board-certified physicians. Mercer's smile was a knife edge. He turned to face her directly, playing to his audience. Maybe you'd like to walk us through your methodology, Your vast experience in trauma care. More laughter from the interns. A few of the attending physicians exchanged glances, the uncomfortable kind that suggested they'd seen this show before and knew exactly what it was. A cage match disguised as teaching rounds. Rachel didn't blink. Didn't shift her weight. She let him continue, let him build his performance piece, let him layer on 3 more minutes of public condescension while the medical students watched and took notes and whispered among themselves. She let the moment become what it was meant to be, a ritual humiliation, a demonstration of power, a reminder of hierarchy. Only when his voice began to lose steam, only when he'd exhausted his material and was preparing to move on to the next patient, did she speak. Her voice came out steady. Quiet. Like a tank idling in a garage. Your hands were shaking during that chest tube insertion yesterday. The SEAL patient in for 12. She didn't look at him directly. Her gaze remained fixed on that same point above his head. When's the last time you actually treated a trauma patient instead of just signing off on inflated equipment orders? The room went dead silent. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Someone's phone buzzed. A monitor beeped 3 rooms away. But in this moment, in this circle of medical professionals, the silence had weight. It had presence. It pressed down like a physical thing. Mercer's face cycled through colors, red to purple to a shade of white that suggested all his blood had pooled somewhere south of his brain. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. The prepared remarks he'd lined up died somewhere in his throat, stillborn and useless. Rachel turned and walked away from him. Not quickly. Not in retreat. With the fluid precision of someone who'd made a statement and found it adequate. She moved past the interns, past the attending physicians, and back out into the hallway where the air tasted like antiseptic and stale coffee. By afternoon, Dr. Mercer had built a documentation fortress. Incident report filed at 1:22 p.m. citing insubordination. Another at 2:23 p.m. for failure to follow chain of command. A third at 3:15 p.m. for creating a hostile work environment and undermining physician authority. Each form was carefully worded, professionally crafted, weaponized bureaucracy. He invoked obscure hospital policies about temp staff limitations, hospital code sections about scope of practice violations, credentialing regulations that would take months to untangle. He was building a paper trail that would bury her before she could connect his inflated billing scheme to the supply company kickbacks, before she could prove that the phantom discrepancies in trauma inventory weren't errors, they were systematic theft. By 4 p.m., he was ready for the next move. Rachel was restocking supplies in the ICU when she heard him. Not his voice at first, just the rhythm of his footsteps, the deliberate pace of a man who decided something. He found her by the vending machines where the maximum concentration of hospital staff took their 15-minute breaks. 3 nurses were there, 2 residents, an attending from cardiology. Witnesses. Exactly what he needed. You're the temp nurse questioning MY orders. Mercer's voice was loud enough to carry across the entire break room. Theatrical. Performed. I've been practicing medicine since before you learned to empty bedpans, sweetheart. One more word about phantom discrepancies in supply orders, one more public questioning of my clinical judgment, and I'll have security escort your incompetent ass out of this hospital before end of shift. The interns stopped chewing. Their phones came out like reflexes. Someone was recording. Someone was always recording now. Rachel stared at him with those flat, dead eyes, the kind of eyes that made grown men want to look away, that suggested she'd seen things that stripped the world down to its component parts. She didn't defend herself. Didn't explain. Didn't apologize. Just looked at him with a gaze like polished stone. The phantom here isn't the discrepancies, Doctor. Her voice was softer than before, which somehow made it carry further. It's the $20,000 in chest tubes billed last month. For a unit that treated 6 trauma cases. 6. The math doesn't work unless someone's creating phantom patients to justify phantom supplies. Mercer's hands began to shake. Actual tremor. Visible. Undeniable. "You're done here," he whispered. "Do you understand me? You're finished." Rachel walked away again, moving past him with the same measured pace she'd used in grand rounds, the same composure that suggested she'd already won whatever battle he thought he was fighting. She didn't go back to the supply room. She didn't clock out early. She went directly to the ICU, to room for 12, to the young SEAL with the catastrophic injuries and the eyes that tracked her like she was the only solid thing in a room of ghosts. She checked his vitals. His oxygen saturation was running 94% on the current ventilator settings. His heart rate steady. His pupils reactive. All the metrics that suggested his body was healing, even if his mind was still trapped in whatever desert had taken everything from him. Rachel sat down on the edge of his bed. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. There was a language between them that existed below words, the language of people who understood that some things could only be communicated through presence. Through showing up. Through refusing to leave. The folded flag in her locker downstairs sat in darkness, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age. A flag from a funeral she'd never attended. A name she'd never been allowed to speak. A rank she'd been ordered to forget. But she hadn't forgotten. Not one detail. Not one face. Not one moment of the operation in Ramadi that had gone catastrophically wrong, that had led to the Pentagon deciding Captain Rachel Torres was more valuable erased than alive. She ran her hand along the SEAL's arm, careful to avoid the 4 lines, the monitoring leads, the apparatus of medical machinery that was keeping him anchored to this world. His muscles were starting to atrophy. 2 weeks in a hospital bed reduced even trained operators to shadows of themselves. She'd need to work with physical therapy. She'd need to push him harder than the standard protocols recommended. She'd need to remind him that the body could heal even when the mind had decided otherwise. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly. "Whatever he thinks he's doing. Whatever papers he's filing. I'm going to be here when you wake up all the way." The SEAL's eyes moved toward her voice. Recognition. Trust. The kind of bond that formed only when someone showed you they were willing to die for you. Not metaphorically. Not in some abstract sense of professional dedication. Actually die. Rachel had done it before. She'd throw herself between gunfire and a patient without hesitation, without calculation, without the luxury of choosing between her safety and her duty. Her duty had always come first. Her duty had always been the only thing that mattered. Outside the hospital windows, Savannah was sliding into evening. The Spanish moss hung from the live oak trees like something between memory and grief. Somewhere in the administrative offices, Dr. Mercer was filling out more incident reports, building more of his fortress, convinced that paperwork was power, that documentation was destiny. He had no idea that the woman he was trying to destroy had spent 3 years training operators who would have gladly died for her without question. He had no idea that the quiet competence he'd mistaken for subordination was actually the calm that came from having already survived the worst the world could offer. She would save this SEAL's life. She would save every life that came through those doors. And Dr. Mercer would discover exactly how little his incident reports mattered when certain people decided it was time for the truth to finally walk into the light. The monitor's alarm shrieked at 0200 hours like a warning siren nobody wanted to hear. Rachel's eyes snapped from the chart to the screen. 94. 88. 78. The SEAL's oxygen saturation was hemorrhaging downward, 30 seconds to catastrophic failure, and the on-call physician was 17 minutes away on a good night. This wasn't a good night. His chest rose and fell, but something was fundamentally wrong with the mechanics. The breathing was there. The oxygen wasn't staying. She moved closer to the bed, her trained eyes cataloguing the impossible math. Skin pale as hospital sheets. Neck veins distended like they might burst through the surface. And the trachea, there. The deviation. Sharp. Left. His windpipe was being crushed by something inside his own chest. Tension pneumothorax. Air had leaked into the pleural space, collapsed the lung, and was now compressing the entire mediastinum like a living vice. Every breath he took made it worse. Every heartbeat was a countdown. The resident hadn't noticed. The night shift was 2 nurses at the far end of the ICU, both drowsy, both trusting the machines to alarm if something critical happened. They didn't understand that machines lag behind human physiology by precious seconds. The machines were catching up to a disaster that had already begun. By the time the attending got here, the SEAL would be in arrest. Rachel's hands were already moving. Muscle memory from a place she wasn't supposed to remember, from training she wasn't supposed to have had, took over completely. 14-gauge needle. The biggest bore that would fit between human ribs without tearing the vessels. She'd done this before, once in Ramadi under artillery fire, once in a forward operating base with nothing but field medical supplies and a combat medic's desperation. The patient had died anyway. This one wouldn't. She didn't announce what she was doing. Announcing meant delay. Announcing meant someone would ask for the attending physician or cite protocol or hesitate. She prepped the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the exact anatomical sweet spot between ribs where the needle could slide through without hitting the neurovascular bundle. Antiseptic was ice-cold against his pale skin. Her hands were steady. They were always steady when it mattered. The needle went in. The plastic catheter followed the metal stylet through the chest wall, through the parietal pleura, into the pneumothorax. And then, the hiss. That unmistakable hiss of trapped air escaping, pressure releasing, the sound of salvation in a single mechanical exhalation. One moment of pure physics, tension converting to relief. The needle became a one-way valve, a lifeline, a bridge between death and survival. The monitor responded first. The oxygen saturation began its climb. 78. 82. 88. 92. The curve was gentle and inevitable, the way recovery sounds when someone who knows what they're doing takes over. His chest wall relaxed. The desperate struggle left his shoulders. Breath came easier. The trachea began its slow correction back to midline, the compression releasing as the air inside his chest rebalanced with atmosphere. 94. Stable. Rachel secured the needle with one hand and reached for tape with the other, an economy of motion that came from more than a decade of combat medical training. No wasted movement. No hesitation. No confusion. This was what her hands had been built to do, not push medications on someone else's orders, not document treatment she didn't believe in, not defer to physicians who were visibly incompetent. This was the work her nervous system had been engineered for since basic medical officer training at Fort Sam Houston. The SEAL's eyes fluttered open for a moment, consciousness returning as oxygen finally reached his brain again. He looked directly at Rachel, and even through the haze of sedation, she could see recognition. Not of who she was, he couldn't know that. But recognition that she'd just saved his life. That the person standing over him in the darkness knew exactly what she was doing. That was when the ICU doors burst open. The sound was wrong immediately. Not the soft pneumatic hiss of controlled entry. The violent crash of metal against metal. 2 figures in tactical gear, boots hitting tile with the precision of trained operators, moving with the predatory fluid grace that came from years of room-clearing drills and live-fire scenarios. Rachel's brain processed this in parallel tracks simultaneously. The gear was professional, the movement was professional, the weapons they carried were absolutely not hospital security, and the trajectory of their entry was a direct line to this bed. This bed. The SEAL's bed. She'd been hiding for 3 years from exactly this scenario. Not hospital violence. That would have been almost manageable. This was the nightmare scenario, the people who'd made her disappear coming back to finish the job. Or worse, coming back to finish his job. The SEAL who'd become a medic after she'd gone underground, who somehow had the access and training to know what decompression was supposed to look like, who'd impressed Dr. Mercer enough to get admitted to St. Michael's instead of a military hospital where he belonged. The first rounds came in two-shot groups, the sound like industrial jackhammer strikes. Double tap, double tap. Center mass. The man in front of the tactical formation wasn't aiming at random. He was aiming at the bed. At the patient. At the young man whose oxygen saturation had just stabilized because Rachel had committed every violation of protocol that existed to keep him breathing. She didn't think. Thinking would have taken too long. She moved forward into the fire, throwing her body across the SEAL's chest like she could stop bullets with her sternum and ribs. The first round punched through her abdomen below the navel, a hit that should have missed but didn't, a trajectory that was meant for his pelvis but found her instead. The impact was less painful than it was shocking, a violent shove, a sudden blooming pressure, the sensation of something vital being disrupted without warning. The second round caught her chest, high on the left side, the one that made her understand this wasn't random fire. These were aimed shots. Methodical. Professional. The kind of fire that came from someone who'd been trained to shoot center mass, and she was center mass now, standing between two figures and their target. The pain arrived a half-second behind the wound, a white-hot flowering that made her gasp. One of her lungs was compromised. She could feel the pressure building in the pleural space, the ironic mirror image of the SEAL's injury. Tension pneumothorax, self-inflicted, iatrogenic, and completely predictable given her current decision-making. The third round came too high, catching her shoulder. She had the strange clarity to notice that the shooter had adjusted for her body position, compensating for her movement, still trying to get the SEAL. They were persistent. She'd give him that. But she was heavy, and she was blocking the angle, and even professionally trained operators understood basic ballistics. Flesh stops bullets if there's enough of it, if you're willing to go through a person to reach what's underneath. She didn't fall gracefully. That was a fiction from the movies. She fell hard, her weight collapsing across the SEAL's torso, her hands finding the bed rail to stay upright for 1 more second, 2 more seconds, trying to maintain the shield. Someone was screaming, the night shift nurse, registering what her brain had just processed, an ICU full of armed violence, a patient under fire, a temp nurse taking bullets like a human barricade. The tactical figures were already turning, already reassessing, already recognizing that the geometry had changed and their target was now fully compromised. One of them spoke into a radio, nurse intercepted. Target still secured. Medical is en route. They moved toward the exit with the same precision they'd entered, leaving behind 3 shell casings and 1 hospitalized temp nurse bleeding into white hospital blankets. Rachel's vision was doing strange things. The ceiling lights were very bright. The pain was receding into something abstract and distant, which was a bad sign. Shock was coming, or hemorrhage was accelerating, or both. She could still feel the SEAL's heartbeat beneath her collapsed body, still sense his oxygen saturation climbing toward normal on a monitor she could no longer see. 95%. Climbing. He was going to live. The needle decompression had worked. Even with 3 rounds in her abdomen and chest, even with her own lung probably collapsing as pneumothorax mirrored the injury she'd just treated, even with the strange cold sensation spreading through her core, he was going to live. That was when the ICU filled with voices. Code blue announcements. The crash cart. Footsteps running. Dr. Chen's voice, clinical and furious, 2 in the abdomen, 1 nicked the left lung. Get her to surgical, now. Rachel wanted to tell them something about the decompression, about the needle placement, about the exact degree of angle she'd used on the second intercostal space. But her mouth wasn't cooperating anymore. The fluorescent lights were very far away. The sound of the ventilator wheezed somewhere to her left, keeping someone else alive, someone young enough to have decades ahead. Someone she'd just purchased with her own blood loss. The operating room lights swam above her like hostile suns. Rachel's eyes opened to the sound of a ventilator wheeze and Dr. Sarah Chen's face materializing above surgical masks, her expression a careful blend of relief and something else, concern, maybe, or the particular exhaustion that came from holding someone's abdomen together for hours. "Welcome back, Captain." Chen's voice was quiet. Professional. She'd figured it out somehow, or she wouldn't be using that word. 2 through-and-throughs in the abdomen. 1 nicked your right lower lobe. You're lucky the rounds tumbled after entry. Another centimeter left and we'd have lost you on the table. Rachel's hand moved to her torso and found bandages, drainage tubes, the particular heaviness of fresh surgical closure. Staples. 17 of them, she counted by feel, pulling across her abdomen like a railroad built through her own flesh. Pain was information. This pain said, you're alive, you bled, you're still bleeding, move wrong and you'll bleed more. The seal, Rachel's voice came out like she'd swallowed gravel and nails. How long? Stabilized. Breathing on his own now. You bought him time. Chen paused, checking monitors. You also violated about 8 different protocols by performing that needle decompression without physician authorization. Dr. Mercer is very upset about that. As if summoned by his name, Mercer had appeared in the hospital 18 minutes later, moving through the chaos like a man whose entire world had just tilted sideways. The ICU was still a controlled disaster, police, federal agents interviewing staff, the trauma bay cordoned off as an active investigation scene. Mercer walked past all of it with the purpose of a man who'd decided his narrative first and would build evidence backward to support it. He went directly to medical records and began typing. For pages. Then 7. Then 17. The incident report accumulated like sediment, each paragraph another layer of protection, another distance between himself and scrutiny. He claimed Rachel had violated the protocol requiring physician authorization before emergency procedures. He documented that her needle decompression, while it may have had an incidental positive outcome, had been conducted without proper oversight and represented a serious breach of hospital hierarchy and patient safety protocols. He wrote that her actions, though they appeared to have assisted the patient, created liability and demonstrated poor judgment in following the chain of command. He added a notation, prior concerns about this employee's reliability and adherence to institutional guidelines warrant immediate investigation. There were no prior concerns. But there were now. By the time the incident report was filed, Mercer had created a documentation fortress so solid that it didn't matter what had actually happened in that ICU at 0200 hours. What mattered was what the paperwork said. He was building the justification for her termination before anyone could ask why a temporary nurse had been more decisive in a crisis than a licensed physician. Before anyone could notice that his hands had trembled during the chest tube insertion Rachel had witnessed. Before anyone could find the supply discrepancies she'd been asking about. 18 hours post-surgery, Rachel pulled on her scrubs despite the white-hot objection of every nerve ending in her abdomen. The staples felt like they might open if she moved too fast, each step a negotiation between her body's desire to bleed and her refusal to acknowledge it. Chen found her at her locker, half-packed, moving like someone had replaced her joints with grinding metal. You can't discharge yourself. Chen's voice had the particular firmness of someone who'd made this argument before and lost. You're 48 hours minimum, preferably 72. You have 3 penetrating wounds. You're on for antibiotics, you have a chest tube, you need monitoring. Rachel just shook her head and kept moving. The folded flag sat on the top shelf, her teammate's name embroidered on the citation she'd never been allowed to read at his funeral. She grabbed it. She grabbed her locker key. She moved with the careful precision of someone who'd worked through worse injuries in worse places, which wasn't true anymore, but muscle memory didn't care about technicalities. Rachel. Chen used her first name this time, which meant she was running out of arguments. Please. Rachel paused long enough to meet her eyes. I've survived things that would kill most people. I can survive leaving. She didn't say, I've survived 2 different deaths already. She didn't say, paperwork is just another kind of weapon. She just walked out into the savannah night with bandages already seeping through her shirt and a flag in her hand like a compass pointing nowhere. The all-night diner on Victory Drive was empty except for a guy reading 3-day-old newspapers and a waitress who'd stopped asking questions about the world sometime in 2014. Rachel ordered coffee and sat in a vinyl booth with the folded flag on the table in front of her. The window was dark enough to reflect her face back at her, and behind that reflection was the ghost of someone else, Captain Rachel Torres, the medic who'd held a defensive position in Ramadi for 6 hours after her extraction team was killed, keeping 3 critically wounded operators alive until reinforcement. Now she was translucent. A shadow in a diner booth at 3 in the morning, bleeding through bandages slowly enough that it might take hours to notice. The coffee went cold. She didn't drink it. Her phone buzzed at 03 for 7 hours. Termination notice effective immediately, the message read. Pending investigation into the incident of March 15, citing protocol violations, unauthorized medical procedures, endangerment of patient, security violations, pending criminal investigation into the shooting. She was terminated for the thing that had saved someone's life. The irony was so sharp it cut. But that wasn't the worst part. Attached to the termination notice was the 17-page incident report Mercer had filed. It was, she had to admit, beautifully constructed. He'd woven together her emergency procedure, the shooting, her lack of physician authorization, and her failure to follow the chain of command into a narrative that made her look reckless rather than life-saving. He'd documented nothing that was technically untrue, but he'd arranged the truth like a prosecutor arranging evidence, only the pieces that led to conviction. She'd been erased twice. Once by the Pentagon, told that Captain Torres had died in that operation in Ramadi and speaking her real name would endanger everyone she'd ever served with. Once by paperwork, filed by a man who'd been committing fraud for months and needed her to disappear more than she needed to survive. The second erasure would be faster. Cleaner. No one would mark it with a folded flag. She stared at her reflection in the dark window for 2 hours and 34 minutes, watching the hours change on the clock above the register. At some point a waitress refilled her coffee. At some point the sun started considering the idea of rising. At some point Rachel Torres, nurse, captain, phantom, no one, understood that surviving was going to be more complicated than bleeding, and bleeding more complicated than staying. She was still sitting there when Dr. Chen walked in, moving like someone who hadn't slept, ordering coffee like someone who'd given up on making better decisions than this. Chen saw Rachel and pulled the second chair at her table without asking permission. "The FBI is here," Chen said. "Not about the shooting. About Mercer. They've been investigating the hospital's billing fraud for 6 months. When they pulled records from the incident, they found something." Rachel didn't look at her. Didn't look away from her reflection. "He forged your personnel file," Chen continued quietly. "Backdated disciplinary issues. Fabricated prior incidents to justify immediate termination. The metadata on the documents doesn't match." The FBI's forensic accountant noticed it and started asking why a doctor was so desperate to erase a temp nurse. Rachel's hand moved to the folded flag. Her finger traced the embroidery, her teammate's name, each letter a small rebellion against forgetting. "They're asking for you," Chen said. "The agents. They want to know what you saw. What you know about the supply discrepancies. They want to know why Mercer was so afraid of you." Rachel turned to look at her then. Really looked. Chen had circles under her eyes the color of old bruises and a steadiness in her face that said she'd made a choice somewhere around 0300 hours to trust a ghost. "What do you think happens next?" Rachel's voice was still gravel, but quieter now. "Different." Chen didn't answer right away. She looked at the folded flag, at the woman holding it, at the particular kind of exhaustion that came from having survived things that shouldn't be survivable. "I think," Chen said carefully, "that sometimes the people you're supposed to hide from are the ones who find you anyway." Somewhere in the hospital, 200 soldiers were getting dressed in dress uniforms, polishing boots, clipping medals to dress jackets. Somewhere in the FBI field office, forensic accountants were pulling financial records that would take Mercer apart piece by piece. Somewhere in Savannah, the morning was coming whether Rachel Torres was ready for it or not. She picked up the folded flag and held it like it weighed 300 pounds and contained everything she'd been before someone told her to stop existing. "All right," she said. "Let's go." They stood together, the doctor and the ghost, and walked toward a daylight that would burn away every shadow and alibi she'd hidden in for 3 years. Behind them, the diner waitress collected the cold coffee cup and the 17-page incident report Rachel had left on the table. She smoothed it out and read Mercer's words, understanding none of it, understanding all of it. Some people, the waitress thought, don't deserve the titles they carry. And some people carry titles that were stolen before they had the chance to earn them back. The fluorescent lights hummed above the empty booth like approval or the persistent hum of a world that had nearly forgotten to notice who'd been bleeding in plain sight all along. On the third day, Rachel walked through the hospital's main entrance like a ghost returning to a place that had already forgotten her name. Her bandages were still wrapped tight beneath her scrubs. The surgeon had warned her that lifting anything heavier than a coffee cup would rupture the sutures, that the bullets had carved through tissue that would take months to rebuild, that she'd been lucky 3 times over. Lucky. The word tasted like copper in her mouth. The ICU doors slid open, and she stopped. The entire unit had been transformed. 200 Special Forces operators stood in formation, full dress uniform, boots aligned on the linoleum like soldiers planted in concrete. They didn't move. They didn't breathe. They simply stood there, waiting, their presence so dense the fluorescent light seemed to dim in response. Rachel's hand instinctively moved to her chest, feeling the thin scar beneath her shirt, muscle memory from a different life, a different uniform. She'd worn that uniform once. She was supposed to never wear it again. The SEAL patient lay in bed 7, eyes tracking her movement across the room. He was awake now, breathing without the ventilator, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of someone the Pentagon had tried to bury in a mass grave in Ramadi but who'd refused to stay dead. When she met his eyes, he smiled. A real smile, the kind that came from understanding something the world had hidden. His lips moved. One word, whispered so quietly only she could hear it across the 18 feet of silence between them. Phantom. That single syllable detonated her cover like a claymore mine buried beneath everything she'd constructed. Not Rachel Torres, temporary nurse. Not the invisible woman who moved through trauma bays like a ghost. Phantom. The call sign that belonged to Captain Rachel Torres, Special Operations Medical Command, the medic who'd gone dark in Ramadi 3 years ago and whose name had been redacted from every official record, whose service had been erased so thoroughly that even her death had been classified. A Marine gunnery sergeant stepped forward from the formation, his uniform so starched it could cut, his voice carrying through the ICU like a command that made the walls listen. He held a certificate printed on parchment that seemed to glow under the harsh hospital lights. His voice was granite. Captain Rachel Torres, Special Forces Medical Command. By order of the Commander, United States Special Operations Command, you are hereby recognized for extraordinary heroism above and beyond the call of duty. He paused. The silence was absolute. Not even the heart monitors dared beep. During Operation Keystone in Ramadi, 2021, Captain Torres voluntarily entered a hostile fire zone to extract a wounded team sergeant, providing emergency combat medical care under direct fire while sustaining catastrophic injuries herself. His eyes met hers. She refused evacuation. She refused pain medication. She continued treating casualties for 4 hours until backup arrived. She saved 7 lives that night. All 7 are present today. The gunnery sergeant's voice didn't crack. Voices like his never did. Bronze Star. A pause. An intake of breath from 200 soldiers. Silver Star. Another pause, longer this time. The weight of it hung in the air like humidity before a storm. 2 Purple Hearts. The operators didn't applaud. They didn't move. But something shifted in their posture, a collective straightening, a moment of recognition so profound it altered the pressure in the room. And a Navy Cross. The gunnery sergeant looked directly at Rachel as he spoke the last words, the highest medal, the one that meant she'd done something the military considered beyond human. For sustained valor under extreme duress and continued commitment to the mission despite severe wounds that would have justified immediate evacuation. And that's when the real nightmare began. Dr. Mercer shouldered through the formation like a man possessed, his face mottled purple, his voice cracking with the desperation of someone watching everything he'd built collapse into ash. "This is highly irregular," he shouted, his hands gesturing wildly. "Unauthorized personnel in a secure medical facility. This woman violated protocol, endangered patients, falsified documentation." His words scattered like birds when a two-star general moved to intercept him. General Holloway, Deputy Commander of United States Special Operations Command, stepped directly into Mercer's path with the kind of presence that made the air itself defer. His uniform was decorated with medals that had their own medals. He looked at Mercer with the dispassionate expression of someone observing a bacterium under a microscope. Then he rendered a formal salute, fist to chest, held for 2 full seconds, to the medals Rachel had never been allowed to wear. The salute lasted longer than necessary. It was an act of deliberate protocol violation in a doctor's favor. Mercer's face went from purple to white to a shade of gray that suggested his heart was reconsidering its employment. 2 FBI agents in dark suits moved into the ICU like they owned it, Morrison leading, his badge catching the light as he approached Mercer with a folder thick enough to be a novel. "Dr. Mercer, we've been investigating billing irregularities at St. Michael's for 6 months. When you filed that incident report about Ms. Torres," Morrison paused, letting the correction hang like an accusation. "Captain Torres, our forensic team noticed something interesting. You attempted to alter her personnel records. Backdated disciplinary reports. Fabricated incidents going back months." Mercer's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Morrison continued as if the doctor hadn't tried to speak. "We started wondering why a physician would create false documentation about a nurse who'd been asking questions about trauma equipment inventory. So we audited your supply orders. $300,000 in inflated medical supply requests over 18 months. Kickbacks from Allied Medical Supply totaling $78,000 deposited into a shell account registered to your brother-in-law's holding company." The second agent produced handcuffs. They made a sound like ice cracking. "You're under arrest for healthcare fraud, insurance fraud, attempted falsification of federal documents, and obstruction of a federal investigation." The handcuffs clicked shut with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence nobody wanted to read. 200 operators watched in absolute silence as the agents walked Mercer past the formation toward the elevator, his expensive shoes squeaking on the polished floor like something wounded. His mouth moved soundlessly, words that wouldn't form, thoughts that couldn't organize themselves fast enough. At the elevator doors, he turned back one final time, his eyes searching the crowd for something to say, some way to regain control of a situation that had spiraled beyond his understanding. But Rachel stood motionless with that cold, flat stare that had unnerved him from the beginning of her first shift. Now he understood what he'd been seeing all along, not weakness, not incompetence, but the absolute control of someone who'd made life-and-death decisions while bullets cracked overhead and desert sun turned the air into something toxic and alive. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The elevator doors closed on his face like a period marking the end of his career. That was the last time anyone called her just a nurse. 6 months later, Rachel stood on the ceremony platform at Fort Bragg wearing the uniform she'd been forbidden to touch for 3 years, the medals finally on her chest where they belonged. The folded flag, her teammate's flag, her burden, her only proof, sat on her desk in her new office, Director of Special Forces Medical Training, finally in the light beside a photograph of 200 operators who'd reminded her that some things cannot be erased with paperwork or redaction or classified orders. Below the platform, she watched Dr. Mercer load boxes into a medical supply van, his medical license stripped, his law degree worthless, his probation conditions requiring him to work equipment delivery for the same company that had paid him kickbacks. He looked up once, caught her eye across the parade ground, and looked away quickly. The new class of Special Forces medics stood at attention, 43 men and women about to learn the skills that had kept her alive in Ramadi, that had saved a Navy SEAL from a collapsed lung when no one else would move. The SEAL patient now stood beside her as an instructor, healed and back on active duty, the scar on his chest matching the one beneath Rachel's uniform like a signature. She stepped to the microphone. Morning sun caught her captain's bars and threw light across the parade ground. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of command, no longer deferential, no longer careful, just pure authority refined in fire. You're here because someone needs you to be the person who doesn't quit when everything's burning and everyone's screaming. You're here because this job isn't about authority or titles or documentation fortresses built by people too cowardly to do the actual work. She paused. You're here to save lives that command thinks aren't worth saving. To make decisions that policy says you shouldn't make. To be the quiet strength that nobody notices until they need you at 3 in the morning. Her eyes found the supply van pulling away at the gate. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. The 43 medics repeated it back to her, their voices carrying across the parade ground, across Bragg, across the sky. In the front row, the SEAL patient, her reason, her second chance, smiled and whispered phantom. This time, she smiled back. Her name was Captain Rachel Torres. She existed again. The paperwork couldn't erase this. The redactions couldn't hide this. 200 soldiers had made sure of that. And every medic she trained from this moment forward would carry her lesson into the field, that heroism isn't measured in medals or rank, that the quietest people in the room are often the ones holding everything together, that some people will sacrifice everything for strangers and then disappear so completely that you have to cross a desert just to remind them they matter. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever known someone whose strength quietly saved everyone around them, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next time we tell the stories of people the world tried to erase. Let us know in the comments, what would you have done if you wore Rachel's shoes? And if you think about it, there's probably someone in your life right now who's quietly carrying a folded flag of their own.